Computer, what is intentionality?
Intentionality's definition is expressive of intentions.
That's actually a common misconception. According to the philosopher Franz Brentano, everything in the mind is about something. It regards something, it's directed at something. So my belief that the sky is blue, for example, is about the sky. It's about that thing up there. My imagining Santa Claus is, in a sense, about the imaginary person, Santa Claus. My feelings for a person that I love are about or directed at that person. My desire for ice cream is about or directed at ice cream. Brentano thought that everything in the mind has this characteristic. It is directed at something, and it's something that's special about our minds. However, there are some people who disagree. Do you think that there are any mental states that maybe aren't about anything at all, or not directed at anything at all? Barbara Montero, in our introductory reading for today, suggests that perhaps a kind of general feeling of anxiety might not be about anything. Have you ever felt that way? Like just really anxious, but not about anything in particular? Just felt uneasy a lot of the time and not really known why? That might be an undirected kind of anxiety. It's just a feeling that you have, but it's not about anything. It doesn't represent anything, we might say, in the world. Montero tells us that this sort of free-floating anxiety might still maybe be about something, and maybe we're just not aware of it. For example, there might be a time when I feel really uneasy, and thinking about it, I realize that I'm uneasy because I feel like I've let someone down, and it's kind of coloring my emotions for a week at a time or more, and I won't necessarily be aware that that's the reason until I sit and reflect about it. Why do I feel so awful? Oh, it's that thing that I did, or this thing that I'm about to do, even though I hadn't realized it before now. So it's quite possible that even a free-floating anxiety is also about something. This aboutness, this sense that our thoughts and our emotions are directed at things in the world or about things in the world or regard things or people, that is what we call, in philosophy of mind, intentionality. Intentionality, we can define as the feature of mentality that allows minds to have thoughts about or to represent states of affairs, parts of the world, the ways things are. Basically, it's the feature of mentality that allows it to be directed at the world. We often call the mental states that have intentionality content-bearing mental states. Sometimes we call them intentional states. And oftentimes, a lot of these intentional states we also call propositional attitudes. That is, attitudes are things like beliefs, supposings, imaginings, and the sense in which they're propositional is that the content is directed at a proposition, a way that the world could be, or that a way that the world is, a state of affairs, or a set of states of affairs. So those are the things we call propositions. So my belief that the sky is blue is a propositional attitude because my belief is an attitude about the proposition that the sky is blue, if that makes sense. So intentional states, propositional attitudes, oftentimes those are interchangeable, but not all of the time, and we'll talk about why in a minute. So one thing that's key about all of these states is that they're all about something, or that they point to something. They have what we call meanings. The question arises in philosophy of mind whether all mental states are like this. I already mentioned an example from Barbara Montero where maybe a kind of free-floating anxiety could maybe not be directed at anything or be about anything. But there's also questions about, for example, whether my perceptual states are propositional attitudes, whether they are intentional states. Many people, and definitely the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, who we'll be discussing today, think that they are intentional attitudes. But there's a debate also about whether the content, the sort of sense in which my perceptions are about things, is the same as the kind of content that is the content of my beliefs, my desires, my doubts, and my hopes. Why? Well, when I express my beliefs or my desires, when I say, I believe that it's hot outside, I desire to have some ice cream. Those things that I express often in language. And my thoughts also seem to have this language-like characteristic. Whereas my perceptions don't feel the same way from the inside. My perceptions are experiential in a way, whereas my thoughts don't always feel necessarily experiential. And so that leads some people to think that maybe the content, the intentional content of my perceptions might be different from the intentional content of my beliefs, not only in the sense of what they represent, but also how they represent. And that's kind of a too deep topic for today, but we will talk about the problem of perception on the one hand and sort of thought or reasoning on the other in another respect, which I will come to in a minute. Now, why is intentionality important? Why do we care about it? Well, for one thing, it's kind of a mysterious thing that our minds can do, to have thoughts about or to have emotions directed at the world. These types of things aren't usually things that we think regular physical objects in the world have, right? Like this pen, for example, or this plant behind me. They don't seem to be able to have directed thoughts about other things, right? Or take, for example, this glass of water. This glass of water isn't about anything. It's not directed at anything. It just sort of is. And a similar thing could be said, most likely, about this plant behind me, or about this random assortment of objects back here. They don't seem to be about anything or directed at anything. But my thoughts do, right? My desires are directed. My emotions are directed. My beliefs are about something. That tells us that minds have a special property that other types of things in the world don't have. And so some philosophers consider this feature, this intentionality, a mark of the mental. That is to say, it's something that tells us that something has mental properties or that it is a mind. And one important question that's considered nowadays is the question of whether things like artificial intelligence have intentionality, whether their thoughts are about things or are directed at things, or whether they're just sort of mimicking the structure of thought when they respond to questions. Like, for example, computer, tell me a joke.
I was writing a geometry joke, but it turned out too plain. Now I'm back to square pun.
See, it can tell jokes, but does it actually know what it's saying when it says anything? Does it know what geometry is? That's an important question, because as we think about artificial intelligence and as we think about machine learning, we want to know whether we're producing the ability to have directed thoughts, whether the things that seem to represent things in the language used by a machine like this actually does constitute understanding things in the world. Because if it does constitute understanding things in the world, then it's a little bit like us. It has this ability that we have to have intentional attitudes, right? To have propositional attitudes toward the world. And that would mean that it has a little bit of mentality as well, if not a lot of mentality. So one question we really need to answer is, if the mind is just a physical system, like many people believe, how does intentionality arise from it? How is it that we get from very simple objects with no intentionality, like this glass of water, to things like my mind, which might be a physical object? Maybe it's made of a brain, and maybe it has some other components too. How does that brain get to have thoughts about other things? How does this system that is my body have intentional attitudes, given that other types of physical objects don't have this property? Put another way, Barbara Montero asks, how could neurons be directed at or represent other things? It's a question we've got to answer. Now, one possibility is that maybe there is no intentionality at all. Maybe it's just an illusion. Intentionality might be something that we attribute to other beings that resemble ourselves, but that doesn't correspond to any real entity. Maybe there are no minds. Maybe it's just ascriptions of things like beliefs and desires that we have. Maybe I don't actually have any beliefs in my head. Maybe I don't have any actual desires. Maybe that's just a way of describing my behavior, for example. It doesn't correspond to any real objects. That's a view that exists too. So today's class is mostly about introducing the concept of intentionality and starting to think about the different views and attitudes that correspond to this issue. in that vein, I want to present to you a couple of different ways of thinking about how intentionality is manifested in the human mind. And broadly speaking, I'm going to classify these two views about intentionality into representationalist views and non-representationalist views about intentionality. But before we get there, I need to define a couple of terms. So the way that I'm going to be using it, the term proposition is going to mean a state of affairs or a set of possible states of affairs or ways for things to be. And propositions are things that I can have thoughts about or that I can have beliefs about or that I can have desires about. So for example, the sentence, "the cat is on the mat," picks out the proposition, that is the set of ways that things could be that would be making that sentence be true. All of the ways in which cats could sit on mats that would make the sentence, "the cat is on the mat," true. That proposition corresponds to that whole set of ways of the world could be. Now, the term representation is one that will come up a lot in this class. And a representation, I'm understanding, is something that indicates or is about or symbolizes some other thing besides the representation itself. For example, think about Magritte's painting of a pipe. It's a representation of a pipe. It's not itself a pipe, as the joke basically of the painting says. This is not a real pipe. And the word pipe in the painting is also a representation of a pipe. Now, of course, the picture of the pipe and the word pipe are different types of representations, but they're both things that symbolize something other than what that object actually is, right? So the painting of a pipe is not itself a pipe, but it represents a pipe. Resemblance can be one way for things to represent other things. For example, the painting of a pipe looks a little bit like a pipe. It's just two-dimensional instead of three-dimensional, right? But the colors are similar. The shape is analogous in some ways. So the picture of the pipe resembles the pipe, and because it resembles the pipe, it represents the pipe. But it's not necessary for something to resemble another thing in order to represent it. And in fact, resembling a thing isn't always a way for something to represent it either. For example, you could represent a banana with the black and white print word banana. And the word banana looks nothing like a real banana. It also might be the case that something looks like a banana, but it doesn't represent a banana. You could find maybe a cucumber that's shaped kind of weird, shaped kind of like a banana. But the cucumber isn't a representation of a banana. The cucumber is just a cucumber, right? So resemblance doesn't necessitate representation, but often, if not always, our representations can resemble the things that they are representations of. Also, when we talk about representations, we can talk about something like indications. So sometimes things can indicate without necessarily representing. One example might be how tree rings, right? In a tree stump, if you cut a tree and you just have the stump left, the tree rings indicate the age of the tree. They indicate, but they don't represent the age of the tree, because you might think the tree rings aren't a representation of the age of the tree. They're a result of the age of the tree. And so they can tell us information about the age of the tree, but they're not like a symbolic stand-in for the age of the tree, right? So they indicate, they don't necessarily represent. Some things might also represent accidentally. Sometimes clouds look like cute bunnies, and they might be, in our minds, representing bunnies, even though they're not deliberately about bunnies, right? Unless we think that there's some powerful being who is able to shape the clouds to look like things on purpose. Most of the time, clouds only accidentally represent objects that we remember. So sometimes things represent other things because we attribute a value or a symbolic value to that object, not because it represents intrinsically. So those are cases of accidental representation. Now, we've talked about representations a lot, and some philosophers think that we have mental objects or functional mental processes that amount to mental representations. So things like, in the sense of what they do, not necessarily in what they look like, things like the picture of the pipe or the word pipe, we might have things that function like that in our minds. Those things we might call mental representations. So it's a mental entity that has representational powers, such as a mental symbol maybe, or a mental stand-in for a distinct object, or maybe just a functional process that does the same thing, basically a functional equivalent of a symbol. And representationalism is a view in philosophy of mind that thinks that there are such entities in the mind. So a subset of representationalists, for example, think that there is a language of thought, a set of symbols that I use to think with. Basically, there's a language in my mind. And it's because of that that maybe I'm able to use like natural language, like the English language, for example, that I'm using now. Some people think that that's a function of my mind already having a language-like structure. I'm just externalizing it in the form of natural language. But that's a subset of the views in representationalism. Just as there are representationalists who think that we have mental representations, mental equivalents of symbols and things like that, there are people who deny that, who think that we absolutely do not have mental representations. One example of these types of people is the philosopher Merleau-Ponty. Now, Merleau-Ponty thinks that representationalism is problematic from the outset. Ideas, he thinks, are meant to be the objects of consciousness, and we are aware of them. They are what our attitudes are aimed at, so to speak, but this begs the question of intentionality on his view, which is, namely, how do we manage to be aware of anything? Representations, in a way, already presuppose that we have the ability to represent. But the big mystery is how we get that ability in the first place. So Merleau-Ponty thinks that representationalism is not a solution to the problem of intentionality. It just sort of presupposes that there might be a way of getting around it. Merleau-Ponty is often what we call a phenomenologist. It's a particular branch of views in philosophy arising from a 20th century kind of German and French continental, we say, tradition. Don't worry about that. The main point is that Merleau-Ponty has a particular type of phenomenological view. Not everybody in phenomenology agrees about the right view of intentionality. So according to one phenomenological view, that of Edmund Husserl, the world and me aren't exactly separate. I am in the world in a way that is inseparable from the world. So my perception is not of something on his view, but instead it's as of something. So there might not be an external world as far as phenomenology is concerned, which means that the view of intentionality that is built by someone like Husserl is going to be a very different one from that of someone who does think that there is a mind-world distinction that's significant. So someone like Husserl will say, distinguish the objects of consciousness, the things that my thoughts are directed at, and the content of consciousness, that is, what my thoughts mean. Now that's just a sketch of Husserl's account, and some of that might be a little confusing. The important part is that it's actually quite different from Merleau-Ponty's account. Following Taylor Carman, we might call Merleau-Ponty's view the descriptive account of intentionality. Merleau-Ponty was interested in differentiating his account from both the empiricist account, like the representationalist account, and the semantic paradigm held by Husserl. So both of those, on Ponty's view, are versions of representationalism, and he wants to repudiate representationalism. He thinks that actually intentionality is constituted by non-cognitive bodily skills. So my intentionality, my ability to think about objects or to interact with objects in the world, isn't about having symbols in my head. It's about having skills and dispositions and engagement with the world. The content of my experience is not semantic content. It's not a proposition, like what I described earlier, but it's instead an intuitive coherence in practical circumstances. So it's a way of responding to the world intelligently. So for him, perceiving is already having a body. It's inhabiting a world. It's acting on the things that I see. And intentional attitudes are modes of existence, ways of being in the world. So there are stances, if you like, toward the world, as opposed to attitudes with content, like propositional content. One of the things Merleau-Ponty was interested in resolving was the mystery of materialism. So Merleau-Ponty says, the mystery is that we're open onto the world. We do kind of live in a world, but we're embedded in it as well. We're sort of located in it. We're a part of it. And that requires us to presuppose that materialism is true. But Husserl didn't necessarily presuppose that materialism is true. The way Merleau-Ponty sees to get out of this kind of, if you like, skeptical attitude, the skeptical hypothesis toward the externality of the world, the materiality of the world, is to say that we are fundamentally material, we're fundamentally embodied, and even our thought is a material act. It's a way of being in the world that doesn't require us to talk about two substances the way that Descartes did. So you can see how his resolution goes kind of on a different path than one that we'll see later in the semester that has been taken by some other thinkers that were looking to resolve into a materialist paradigm of the mind. Carmen says, quote, the looming target of all Merleau-Ponty's efforts was rationalism, the idea that thought constitutes our essential relation to the world, that for our attitudes to have content at all is for them to be, as Descartes said, modes of thinking. But perception is not a mode of thought. Quote, it is more basic than thought, unquote. So thinking is more like perceiving on Merleau-Ponty's view than rationalists think, not because perception and thought have the same kinds of intentional content, but because thought and perception share many of the same underlying intuitive structures, the structures of responding to an environment that I'm embedded in. Here's another quote. Merleau-Ponty's central philosophical insight about perception, then, is that it is not just contingently, but essentially bodily. Perception is not a private mental event. Perception is not a mental event at all. It's a bodily event, basically. So we stop thinking of there being a boundary between my mind and the world and start thinking of my mind as being an embodied thing, something that is part of the world and that is existing alongside within the world. Here's another quote. For Merleau-Ponty, the relation between perception and the body is neither causal nor logical. Instead, all explicit thought about perception is parasitic on a more basic understanding we have of ourselves simply in virtue of being embodied perceivers. We have a pre-reflective grasp of our own experience as coinciding with them, unquote. So essentially, I'm trying to present to you two broad ways of thinking about intentionality. The descriptive account of Merleau-Ponty, the embodied account, is one in which intentionality arises because of our interactions with the world, but there's nothing that is especially mental. There's nothing special in an ontological sense about my ability to have directed thoughts about the world. It's just a fact of how I interact. However, on the representationalist view, of which there are many kinds, including phenomenological and non-phenomenological accounts of representationalism, the way in which I can have directed thoughts about the world depends on my mind having a particular, maybe mental structure, having things like representations that are mental entities that have this capacity to be directed at the world or to have content that might be language-like or that might be proto-linguistic in some way, where my mind structures the things that are coming into it and then interacts with those structures within itself to produce new things. So for example, I can have thoughts about a particular person, I can have particular thoughts about Barbara Walters, for example, or I can have general thoughts about people, not a particular person, but just persons, for example. I can have thoughts about women as a category that are not necessarily about specific women. I can have thoughts about buildings in general without having a directed thought about a specific building. And some people believe that representationalism allows you to explain that sort of ability that we have, because it explains how we have this generalizing ability, how we put things into categories and then are able to use the category itself as a way of representing the world, independently of any particular things that come in front of us. There's also kind of a bunch of more narrow philosophical arguments sometimes put out in favor of representationalism. One of those arguments is called the argument from illusion. This is the argument from illusion. Premise 1. When viewing a straight stick, so let's take this, half submerged in water, in the right circumstances, the stick, one is directly aware of something that seems bent. However, no relevant physical thing is bent. There is nothing in the world that is actually the way that it appears to me to be. Therefore, in this situation, one is directly aware of something that's non-physical. Premise 4. What one is directly aware of in this situation is the same kind of thing that one is directly aware of in normal, non-illusory perception. Same as regular perception. Therefore, in normal perception, one is directly aware of non-physical things. So it turns out that this case of thinking about a stick, or in this case a pen, that appears bent in water, I'm aware that the thing that appears to me to be the case doesn't correspond to anything that actually is the case. So that suggests that there's an intermediary between myself and the world. Representationalists think this intermediary is a representation. I have a representation of the situation in front of me, and that's what I'm directly aware of. The world itself is different from my representation of it, from the thing that I'm directly aware of. And I know this because I can work around often what appears to me to be the case and get to what is actually the case. But it's not because I'm directly aware of the world, it's because I have to work around the things that I am directly aware of. Here's another argument. Call it the argument from fallibility. This argument favors representationalism because the other view, which we might call the direct realist view, seems to require non-inferential knowledge about objects. It seems to require that I just know objects directly. Merleau-Ponty's account requires me to just be in the world with the objects. There's no boundary, there's no barrier between myself and the world that I'm interacting with. Here's the argument from fallibility. Premise 1. If one is directly aware of something, then one can have non-inferential knowledge of facts about it. Premise 2. If one knows non-inferentially that something is the case, say that snow is white, then one's belief that snow is white is infallible. Premise 3. No belief about the physical world can be infallible. This is established by the possibility of illusion, hallucination, so on and so forth. The possibility that there is yellow snow. Premise 4. Therefore, no one can have non-inferential knowledge about the world. That is, the suggestion is that the only kind of knowledge you can have about the world is inferential knowledge. Therefore, no one is directly aware of anything physical. So that suggests that even our perceptions are always mediated by something. There's always an intermediary. Call that the representation for now. So in summary, intentionality, the problem of intentionality, is the problem of explaining how my mind is related to other things in the world, and how it seems that I have this property that regular objects don't have, of being able to have thoughts about things, to have desires directed at things, to have emotions directed at things. There's broadly two theories. The representationalist theory, on the one hand, thinks that there are mental entities that give me the ability to have these directed thoughts, or these directed emotions, or these directed desires. And on the other hand, you have non-representationalists, some of whom are direct realists, who think that my ability to have interactions with the world is just sort of direct. I perceive things directly, there's no intermediary. What makes it be the case that I am having thoughts, or that I am having beliefs or desires about certain things, is just about how I'm positioned relative to the world. It's not a relationship between my mind and the world. It's just an action, if you will. It's something that emerges out of my activity. It's not something that I have, if that makes sense. Now, it's impossible to resolve this issue in one lecture, but hopefully you get a sense of the complexity of this question and the complexity of the different types of responses to the question of how we have intentionality and whether we have intentionality. And that's really the only goal for today, is to start getting the gears turning on this problem. Later in the semester, we'll get to talking a little bit more about mental content, and specifically we'll try to talk about what it would take for a non-human being to have intentionality? What would it take for different creatures, for artificial intelligences to have intentionality? That might depend on what your theory of intentionality is. If you think we have representations and the representations are necessary for intentionality, then you'll think that we have to build computers in a particular way, and that maybe it wouldn't be so hard to build them that particular way.
On the web.
Sorry, I got interrupted there by our little friend. Are you done? Yeah, I think she's done. So whether or not we think artificial intelligences have the ability to have directed thoughts might depend on how they're built. If representationalism is true, there's sort of a set of instructions we can follow for how to build them successfully, some people think. But if representationalism is false, there's a different way that we should build computers so that they have directed thoughts. It's still possible on both accounts, on both the representationalist and the non-representationalist account, that maybe artificial intelligence will never have directed thoughts. We'll get into that problem as well. So this has been fun. Nice to talk to you. See you again soon.